Hi, and welcome to the latest trending tech podcast. This time it's on insider threats and how to beat them. My name's Jeremy Cowan, and I'm co-founder of the three technology sites bringing you today's podcast. They are IoT-now.com, vanillaplus.com, and The Evolving Enterprise. And today, we have some extraordinary expertise on insider threats to bring you. First, in the form of Eric Chilton, retired special agent in charge of the USA's Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, or DCSA. Before taking up that post, Eric was supervisory agent in charge of the US Office of Personnel Management, or OPM. He retired in November and is now president of Chilton Security Partners. Eric, a warm welcome to the Trending Tech podcast.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Also, I am delighted to say hello again to Ed Finegold, Chicago-based tech author and communications analyst who has years of experience at the sharp end of telecoms, helping to make communications work. He has worked with organizations ranging from the TM Forum to Netcracker Technology, and I'm proud to say he has written for us on numerous occasions. Ed, it's great to have you back here.
Oh, it's so nice to be back, Jeremy. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Gentlemen, let's get started. I want to look at the serious news headlines first in a particularly serious month. Together, you sent me a link to an article in Homeland Security Today, and we'll include the link to this in the transcript for this podcast. Which of you wants to describe this story to us about insider threats?
I think that's me. All right, so I started looking at the insider threat issue for several reasons. It began doing research into telecom fraud and coming at it, looking more from the cybersecurity and external threat point of view, but then quickly finding that a lot of the frauds that were being committed that involve mobile phones and actually the crossover between mobile and banking, where you see account takeovers happening because of people's mobile numbers being ported fraudulently. When I looked deeper into it, I started seeing what was happening was that most of these were insider attacks for a lot of these different types of schemes. And what you had were that people who had legitimate access to systems were being compromised so that they could do things like unlock phones or port numbers. And sometimes these were as sophisticated as someone being bribed to install a device that an outsider had designed, right? And then they installed it inside a contact center and gave that external person, therefore, free access to systems like number porting and phone unlocking systems. And so I started thinking a lot about like, okay, well, where does this go? And, looking more deeply at it, obviously, a lot of the technology focus has been on external threats, cybersecurity attacks from outside, ransomware, those kinds of things. But interestingly, insider threats are growing maybe as fast or even faster and are potentially a lot more dangerous. And so that's why we brought it up.
So this story seems to be an example of, how what you consider an insider threat or what you look for when vetting people can extend in all sorts of directions. I mean, is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a couple things just to get into quickly. Keep in mind that insider threats are increasing for a few different reasons, right? So we talk about like the vectors that have happened. Let me stick to the technical side, right? Because Eric can really address the people side. On the technical side, what's driving, insider threats? Like, I think maybe another way to put your question, Jeremy, is what's the attack surface, right? Or what does the threat surface look like and how has it changed?
Sure.
And so one of the ways it's changed is that everybody started working from home. And then people's access got all different and people are coming in by VPN and people have their computer systems sitting at home and they have access to sensitive systems. So it changed the entire shape of what's normally defended against, which is, okay, you're in the corporation and you're inside the perimeter. And you can talk to a lot of cyber experts who will say, hey, that perimeter security is not enough. You need more internal monitoring, internal security. Okay, well, we just blew that up too, because now you don't even have the perimeter anymore. So it's sort of not surprising that you'd have a lot more exposure to like a general rise in security incidents, that we're seeing. And it's something like, 67% of companies are experiencing, 21 to 40 incidents a year. And this has increased 60%. Just in 2020, it increased 60%, as people started working from home. And then, inside of that, insider threats incidents have increased 44% since 2020. because of that shift. So the point being that like we've just seen this radical change to behavior, to the threat surface, and that's why we're then seeing this change to the rise in insider threat incidents. And so going back to your question, which I think comes ultimately to Eric, is the why do people get taken advantage of to become insider threats, or why do they act in ways that are against their employer and that sort of thing?
Well, we're going to come to that in the meat and drink of the podcast when we have a chance to talk about this in greater detail. But in the meantime, just looking at the Homeland Security Today article, one of the things that struck me from that was I was pretty surprised that US government departments weren't already classifying domestic violent extremism allegations as a misconduct subcategory, and that there wasn't an official definition of domestic violent extremist. Eric, is that something that I shouldn't be surprised by? I mean, I don't imagine that the UK government is any further ahead, for example.
I personally am not surprised, but then coming from what we're going to phrase as insider knowledge myself, that term in the past, let's say 2 to 3 years, has been a political hot button, to where politicians and those that sign off on laws, executive orders mandating what can or cannot be done by those with access has not legally been defined. So what the United States would determine a domestic problem versus what the UK versus what any other nation on the planet would term a domestic issue is a political topic by nature. So no, it shouldn't really surprise too many people.
Yeah. Well, moving on, there was another story that I wanted us to just dwell on for a moment. It came from bbc.co.uk, and it's well known that Ukraine has developed and hopefully will soon rebuild its flourishing tech scene following the horrendous invasion from Russia. So the news story that interested me was on the cyber front line in Russia's invasion. This was a BBC podcast in the last few days called Inside Science. And again, we'll include a link to the episode in our transcript. The guests were talking about the limited value of Elon Musk's highly publicized single truckload of Starlink dishes being sent to Ukraine to add resilience to its connectivity. Mike Saperton, who's the tech editor at Forbes Ukraine, pointed out in this podcast that this is of limited use in a country of 40 million people, and when additional stock is limited in the market anyway. There's also the risk that the Russians could easily interfere with the signals, or worse still, that they might triangulate the signals to launch more rocket attacks on Starlink locations. But he did point out on the plus side that sanctions on digital technology supplies to Russia are definitely going to have more impact on the Russian administration. Russia's digital business economy will be cut off from software updates, he said, and from licensing. And above all, he points to the effect of a tech brain drain from Russia that has already started. So this is going to be a significant factor in the war. It's probably not going to be a defining factor, but would you add anything to that, Eric?
Yes, as a matter of fact, to piggyback on that article and to discuss another one that coincides with it, just yesterday, the White House government president of the United States issued a statement warning against cyber crimes originating from the former Soviet Union, the Russian states, as it pertains to the incident and the crimes going on in the Ukraine now, and the instability. You talk about being able to triangulate signals, being able to hack, for better of a different term. This is a real threat faced by the planet, but originating in what you termed the technology drain and the brain drain, and the app developers and whatnot originating in the Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, these are significant apps that have come out of Ukraine, not least one of them being WhatsApp. So, these are used by a number of highly significant global corporations. And it's obvious that any interruption to those and their development is going to have a global threat. But it does indicate the importance of Ukrainian technology. We've got to the meat in the sandwich, if you will, now in the podcast, where I really wanted to talk about insider threats in more detail. My first question goes to you, Ed. What makes an insider threat?
Well, I mean, I think the simple answer is that insider threats caused when a person who has access to systems, information, or other resources behaves in ways that are security risks to an organization. Right now, that security risk could be something like a national security risk because that organization has control over, let's say, a power grid, or it could be something simpler, just downtime disruption for a factory or something that's really, really harmful to a business. Even if it doesn't serve some political or national security end, it causes potentially existential problems for the business. And so that's really the basic thing is that it's that the insider threat is it's someone who's already inside who has legitimate access, right? Who's being corrupted to use that legitimate access in negative ways, as opposed to an external threat, obviously, which would be, for example, an attacker, hacking into someone's credentials externally to take over a system or something to that effect. The typical kind of thing you're accustomed to.
So, Eric, are negligent or malicious insider threats the most frequent that we're facing these days?
By far and away negligent, not to say that malicious is not on the rise. And I tell you this because more often than not, the loss of data or the loss of IP or any type of information is not even known by the individual that created the issue. Think of, in the IT world, clicking on links that you're not permitted to, and now somebody has access to your computer without your knowledge. The same happens in human intelligence, where a trained elicitor I can extract anything I want from you with a smile on my face, and you'll only give it to me without even knowing. So it's malicious on the part of the employee due to negligence.
Yeah. And Ed, can you put a cost on this?
Yeah, I've actually seen some research on this from a group called the Ponemon Institute, who actually put out a really strong report on the cost of insider threats. And this actually stood out to me because a lot of times when you're doing research and doing primary research, you don't often stumble over someone else having done a really good study on the specific thing you're looking at. And I did in this case. So props to these folks. And so in any event, a couple of things that they look at are things like the time to contain an incident and then the cost per incident. And those two things are related. And so both of those things have increased. So what Ponemon was saying is that since 2020, there's been more than a third or 33% increase in the cost per insider threat incident. And then when you have a malicious insider threat incident, so someone doing something on purpose, average cost is about $650,000 per incident.
Right.
And that's the incident. On the flip side, companies are spending increasingly to contain threats, right? To have a process and a set of systems in place to deal with the threat once it's identified. And the average cost that apparently the Ponemon found companies are spending is US $15 million just to contain, right? Basically just to manage the cases, right? Your internal security threat cases, $15 million a year. So there's a substantial cost to this. And just quickly, a couple other notes they had was just that organizations will take 77 to 85 days to contain a threat. So you can see why that would be cumbersome and costly. And then the other thing is obviously the cost goes up. So if the containment takes more than 90 days, the average cost will jump to more than $17 million that a company spends. So being inefficient at this, right, and not having a process and not knowing what you're doing is going to cost you all that much more, right, even than just the incident itself. I found that to be pretty interesting.
So just rewinding for a moment, I mean, Eric, why do malicious insiders do it?
Well, I can give you a laundry list of reasons. If they're truly out to get the company, it boils down to a couple of things. Greed. Maybe they have extraneous factors in their life that the receiving party might help them with, be it a lifestyle issue, hiding something in their personal life, or basically finances by far and away. Financial reasons are number one. Others, addictive behaviors. I have found that a lot of times people want to prove that they're smarter than the organization, that they can outthink the rules and regulations, and they do it for no other reason than to prove to themselves that they're as smart as they think they are.
Yeah. Ed, help me here. You've referenced in the past Dennis Nedry in this respect. Who is Dennis Nedry and what did he do?
Yeah. So I just want to, I'm going to answer that. And just as a quick follow up to what Eric was saying, as a backup to that, Verizon, does a breach investigations report. And when they looked at the motivations for insider threat actors, financial was the top reason, and espionage was second, but fun was equal, and grudge was almost equal.
Yeah.
So you can't make assumptions about that people's motivations are necessarily rational. That was the thing I always had issues with, like in college economics, is assume everyone's a rational actor. Well, everyone isn't. Like Dennis Nedry. So who's Dennis Nedry? If you remember the now classic movie Jurassic Park, Dennis Nedry is a character who's really like the caricature of everything you would think of as an insider threat. And Eric and I actually, we're discussing this issue and had a really good laugh. I mean, it's a serious issue, but we had a good laugh about this when we realized that this character, Wayne Knight, who was also Newman on Seinfeld, and we love him for that reason, was Dennis Nedry. And so Dennis was technically skilled. He was very insecure and narcissistic. He was greedy. He was showing a lot of erratic behavior. He would vanish without explanation. And unfortunately, he had access to absolutely everything in Jurassic Park. And so what did he do, right? He in order to make money, and like Eric said, to prove to everyone that he was smarter than all of them, right? He cut a deal with a competitor to steal and then sell them intellectual property, right? And used his access to everything, right, to facilitate his ability to get the material out of the facility and to the, potentially to the dock and to the people that he was stealing it for and get paid, which obviously never happened. If we think about it from a business point of view, what did Nedry do? Well, his bad work created park opening delays, which was a business disruption. His bad behavior also created workplace discord. Another problem was Samuel L. Jackson was very unhappy with him. And right, they had investor difficulties because of his behavior, which is why the lawyer was sent out. The lawyer goes out. Well, the lawyer never went back because he was eaten by a dinosaur, which we'll call a poor guest experience or a poor customer experience, right? So every aspect of the business can be threatened in this way. And then ultimately it was a complete loss of capital and a disaster because of what this guy did. And then he obviously got eaten by a dinosaur, which is sort of beside the point. The point is, though, that this one person, right, with unmitigated access and bad motivations can create a disaster for a business on multiple fronts. And that starts to get scary. And then some, when you think about what are the potential threats for insider threats and where is this going for telecom and for IoT, for example.
Ed, you've hinted at a play-by-play. What are the risk factors affecting companies here that enterprises should be aware of?
Here's what's concerned me as a tech analyst, where you're always looking at a lot of different trends and how they converge, right? Which, something is you're very much in the business of doing as well, Jeremy. So as I was joking with you, okay, when I put my tinfoil cap on, what do I worry about? And, how does this all connect to each other? So think about that. We're moving to API first architectures, right? Something that's much more open and accessible. To make an integration happen between systems, you make a call out to an API, which is sort of a public thing. Then connect that to the IoT world. So the IoT world is existing in that. We're adding a lot more devices. And there's a whole separate story to that I'm sure your audience knows, right? The number of different devices, the expansion of the threat surface, all the different updates to firmware that can be compromised, right? All these different kinds of things that are well explored issues. So now bring that into 5G. You bring on to the 5G world that's emerging, and we're bringing all these things together to do a lot more Industry 4.0 automation, a lot more remote control over factories, over critical systems, over power grids, right, over fuel pipelines, dams, all of these kinds of things. And at the same time that all that automation is happening, these advances are happening, you have companies fighting like crazy for tech talent to bring them in the door, which means that they don't have a lot of incentive to do that slowly or maybe extra carefully beyond what they feel maybe they already do to check all the boxes from a compliance point of view, right? Okay, so now you have all these people in, all this automation, a lot more things are connected, a lot of it's new. It's probably not that well governed if we think about how technology usually evolves. And now we have the opportunity for misused credentials, people who you don't really know their background, who are new in, have the access, are then corrupted, as Eric described, and create some kind of catastrophe. Now I'll take my tinfoil cap off and let you carry on. But that's the daisy chain of things that I think is a real threat that's happening quickly. Yeah.
Understood. Eric, what are your thoughts on the risk factors affecting companies?
Just to follow what Ed was saying, during the course of my career, 25 years, I used to start by saying I deal with people, not machines. And that has certainly changed throughout my career, whereas now it's almost the opposite. So I'll throw in topics like social media and the number of devices and working remotely. Even if you weren't involved in the IT world 10 years ago, you almost have to be now. So things that the government would look at as a threat or a possible malicious incident has absolutely changed by definition just in the past 10 years, and most certainly the past 2 with COVID restrictions and remote access. And now you throw in world politics and wars and who controls the technology and who controls the money behind it. People like me have been forced to learn about machines real fast.
Yeah. And in view of that rapidly changing landscape, Eric, what particularly do you think enterprises should do to protect themselves?
I'm going to say social media restrictions, number one, and I'll give you some examples of people put way too much information online that anybody trolling for information has ready access to. For instance, who you work for, what you do there. Hey, I've got promoted to this and this and this. I'm now in charge of this and this and this. I can start right there of the rabbit hole I want to go down of whom do I contact at the XYZ organization if I'm your competitor and I want to learn about your company's financials. It doesn't have to be tech data, but where are you spending your money? How are you spending your money? This might get me the information that I want.
Well, that makes it sound as though LinkedIn is more than just an asset for good business, but also a bit of a tool for misuse of business.
There's a pro and con to everything. Yes.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, thank you for that. Let's move on because we've got time just left for the section we called What the Tech, where it's a chance for us to look at news that normally I would say may amuse or amaze you. Sadly, in the current circumstances, I'm scratching around for anything that may amuse you. But there is plenty to amaze us. Ed, what's your final story all about?
So there was a story on uktech.news that was kind of a continuing story I've been following about cryptojacking that's been going on. And so just as we were talking about with folks having access to all kinds of things, if you think about the whole migration to cloud and the number of just people, they could be contractors, just developers, things like that now have access that may not be that well governed, to really broad variety of resources, which could be their own companies or could be something that they're maintaining for someone else's company. And then what they're doing is going ahead and setting up crypto mining rigs on someone else's resources. Someone else is footing the bill for the web resources, right? Or for the hosting resources in the cloud. They're setting up these big distributed cryptojacking rigs and then filling their bank accounts with them. And so it just didn't surprise me to see that story because I think we'll see a lot more of it for this reason. And it's just like a really basic idea of an insider threat that's not necessarily a direct attack on anybody, but it's harmful, it's unlawful, and it's something that someone's doing for greed and fun and to prove something, right? And that's just the sort of odd kind of threat that we live with.
As I scrolled down through that story, I knew that cryptojacking was on the rise, but even so, Sonic Wall's report that there were, I think, 436,000 cryptojacking attacks in the UK alone in 2021, compared to 66,000 in 2020. That shocked me. That's a 7-fold increase in a year.
Yeah. Some of it is because people figure out no one's watching. It's funny you describe it as an attack. It's almost like, whoa, is logging into my email an attack? Like what you're doing is basically you're logging into an AWS account and using it. You're just using it in a way it's not supposed to be used. So yeah, sure, that's an attack. It's just kind of funny though, is there's not really anything out of the ordinary about it. You're doing exactly what you would do to do your job. You're just not supposed to be doing it.
I mean,
Right.
we've already talked on here about the added risks, and Eric's mentioned it already about people working from home, bringing in extra risks, and obviously being somewhat outside of the normal defenses. And I noticed in the US just the other day, President Biden has allocated $2 billion to improving America's cybersecurity infrastructure. I mean, I'm hoping that stories like this will focus minds not just among legislators, but amongst chief finance and chief information officers. But maybe we have to have the bad news before people wake up to it. Anyway, the story that I wanted to end with was, again, a serious piece of news. I drew a blank in my search for lighter news, but I did find myself on wired.com looking at a headline called, "Are You Being Tracked by an AirTag?" And again, the link is in our transcript. The story tells you how to check if you are already being tracked or have been tracked. And it gives some useful advice for anyone worried that a tracker is reporting their moves without their consent. To be fair to products like this, they are a great way to find everyday missing objects like car keys or purses that go walkabout all the time, although for some colleagues more than others, I guess, Natalie. But as with so many great tech ideas, they can be misused, with the likes of AirTags and Tiles and others being deployed by stalkers. Wired.com was reporting the other day that New York model Brooks Nader found an AirTag had been slipped into her coat pocket in a bar, and she was tracked for hours before discovering it while walking home alone. And in another case, police in Connecticut arrested and charged a man after a woman found an AirTag in her car. To be fair, I think Apple has responded, and owners of iPhones running iOS 14.5 or newer will receive a push alert whenever an unknown AirTag is near them for an extended time and away from its owner. Apple doesn't say how long the extended time is, though, but you can also play a sound on the AirTag to help locate it. So fair play to Apple for that. And it's also since launched an app called Tracker Detect for Android phones. And the Android app does not automatically look for unknown AirTags. You have to do the scan yourself. Ed, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have thoughts on two sides of it. So on the one side is I don't envy anyone that's living, a very public life right now for these reasons. And so I don't like to say, oh, it's the AirTag's fault. It's another symptom of this really weird stalking culture that's evolved around celebrities and athletes. And it's unfortunate. And then there's a whole set of stories in the US going on right now about a couple of big athletes who are literally having mental breakdowns because of the fans that are getting on them about dumb things. That's kind of a separate story. On the technology side, it's interesting to me, because you get into it's technology being misused. And I was thinking about this the other day that I was walking by very US, Home Depot, big home goods and hardware tool seller. And I'm thinking I could walk into that store and buy a chainsaw or a machete or any of those kinds of things that could be misused, just like an AirTag could be. But no one's hollering at Home Depot not to sell a chainsaw because there's perfectly good uses. You got to cut trees down, right? And so that's where I think is always the challenge here. And if we just go back to the insider threat thing, for example, what's the point of talking about these things? It's trying to get out ahead of it. Right. So what concerns me with any of these things like AirTags is we introduce, or the 737 MAX, we introduce technology very, very quickly, and we kind of deal with the consequences later. And so that was my concern when we were talking about the convergence of all those techs is let's think about the critical mass of gaps that happens and what the consequences of that are, as opposed to looking at everything as an individual piece. Right. Yeah. If that makes sense. So again, I think the AirTag thing is just another example of that. It's the unintended consequences that are really, really negative of something that had a positive intent.
Eric, finally, just coming to you, I liked Ed's comment about getting out ahead of it. How do you think that businesses can do more to get out ahead of some of the challenges, either through malicious or otherwise misuse of their technology?
I would ask companies to think of it almost as a sales pitch that an insurance agent would give you, of not is something going to happen to you is when, and what can you mitigate up front by preparation. So we talked about response time earlier. Look at first responders and the data that they can give you of if you wait 24, 48, 72 hours before a medical incident, what are your rates of survival? The same can be said for any type of security incident, the shock waves of that and the longer it takes to contain. I just encourage you to look at any opportunities you have, whether it's personnel vetting, physical security, IT security, and understand it's not an if, it's when. And to go back to your AirTag story, like many things in this world, I found out the hard way what that was when a friend called me in the middle of the night to say that her younger sister had an AirTag installed on her vehicle by a potential suitor at a nightclub. So I learned about it real fast.
That's shocking. Yeah. Well, it is there for all of us to learn from. Gentlemen, thank you so much. That's all, sadly, that we've got time for. I want to thank you both for sharing your considerable expertise with us. Ed, it's been great to have you on the pod.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's great to be back.
And Eric, it's been fascinating to hear your expert input. Thank you very much for your time too.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
Before we go, let me just say we've got some more great podcasts in the pipeline, including one on next generation automotive connectivity. I'm looking forward to that one too. In the meantime, please subscribe to the Trending Tech podcast wherever you found us today and give us a 5-star rating. We'll not only love you forever, it'll boost us up the rankings and help others find the latest global tech news. So until the next Trending Tech podcast, bye for now.